Hand over your keycard, Walter. You're done here. We're automating the entire leasing portfolio, and frankly, your old-school methods and ridiculous commission rates are a luxury this company can no longer afford. Ryan Vance sneered, tossing a cardboard box filled with my personal belongings onto the polished mahogany conference table. The son of the man who built Summit Retail Properties stood there, his tailored Italian suit matching his unearned arrogance. I looked at the box, then back at his smug face. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply reached into my pocket, placed my keycard on the table, and said, "Understood. The files are organized. Best of luck with the Volumax renewal." I picked up my box and walked out, knowing that in exactly 10 days, the ground beneath his feet would turn to quicksand. It was the spring of 2026, and I had spent exactly 20 years of my life at Summit Retail Properties. I started working here in 2006 when I was 32 years old, hired by the founder, Richard Vance. Richard was a self-made man, a tough but fair developer who understood that in commercial real estate, relationships are the only currency that matters. Together, we had built Summit from a small local firm with 3 suburban strip malls into a commercial powerhouse, managing over 1.2 million square feet of prime retail space across the state. I knew every tenant, every property manager, every local zoning commissioner, and every structural defect in our buildings. Our crown jewel was Summit Plaza, a sprawling 450,000 square foot commercial shopping center situated at the intersection of 2 major state highways. The financial stability of the entire plaza, and indeed Summit Retail Properties itself, rested on our anchor tenant, Volumax Corporation. Volumax occupied a massive 180,000 square foot footprint at the center of the development. They were a regional retail powerhouse, and their presence drew foot traffic that kept the smaller inline tenants thriving. To understand the stakes, you have to understand the numbers. Summit Plaza was backed by a $120 million commercial mortgage held by Commercial First Bank. That loan carried a strict covenant. We had to maintain a debt service coverage ratio of at least 1.25x. Our annual debt service payments to the bank were exactly $12 million. The plaza generated $21.25 million in total annual revenue, which left us with a net operating income of $16.5 million after operating expenses. This put our debt service coverage ratio at a comfortable 1.375x. However, Volumax's 15-year lease was scheduled to expire in exactly 3 months. They paid $8.5 million in annual base rent, which represented 40% of the plaza's total revenue. If Volumax decided to vacate the property, our net operating income would instantly drop to $8.0 million. That would drag our debt service coverage ratio down to a catastrophic 0.67x, triggering an immediate default under our mortgage covenant. Commercial First Bank would have the legal right to accelerate the entire $120 million debt, forcing us into foreclosure and bankruptcy. For the past 2 years, I had been quietly, meticulously negotiating the renewal of that lease with Clara Jenkins, the vice president of real estate for Volumax. Clara was a sharp negotiator who knew exactly how much leverage she held, but I also knew what she needed. I had drafted a creative lease structure that kept their base rent at $8.5 million, but restructured the common area maintenance charges, saving them $300,000 annually while protecting our net income. The deal was 99% complete, pending the final signatures. Under my contract, I was entitled to a base salary of $250,000 and a 1% commission on the gross value of all lease renewals I secured. For a 15-year lease valued at $127.5 million, my commission was going to be exactly $1,275,000, but Richard Vance had suffered a stroke 6 months ago and retired, leaving his son, Ryan, in charge. Ryan was 35 years old, fresh out of business school, and possessed an absolute disdain for the people who actually built the company. He viewed my 20 years of experience as an expensive redundancy. He wanted to automate leasing using web-based portals and replace senior directors with junior analysts, earning $50,000 a year. He saw my upcoming $1 million commission check as a target for cost-cutting. What Ryan did not know, because he had never bothered to read the historical property files, was the story of Parcel B4. Back in 2011, during the land assembly phase for Summit Plaza, we hit a massive obstacle. The layout of the plaza required a narrow 2.5-acre strip of land known as Parcel B4. This strip was owned by a stubborn local developer named Otis Miller. Otis and Richard Vance had been bitter rivals since a failed development project in the 90s. Otis flatly refused to sell the parcel to Summit Retail Properties for any amount of money. Without Parcel B4, we could not build the main delivery access road, the dumpster compactors, or the primary loading docks for the Valumax building. The entire development was dead in the water. Otis Miller, however, was my late mother's cousin. I went to him privately, sat at his kitchen table, and negotiated a solution. Otis agreed to sell the parcel, but only to me personally. I purchased Parcel B4 in 2011 for $150,000 using my personal savings and a home equity line of credit. Rather than selling the land to Summit and taking a short-term profit, I signed a 99-year ground lease with Summit Retail Properties. Because I wanted the company to succeed, I leased the parcel to them for a nominal rate of just $100 per month. But my real estate attorney, Evelyn Hale, drafted a very specific clause into that lease. Clause 14.2, titled Personal Employment Condition, stated that the nominal lease and easement rights were strictly contingent on Walter Thorne remaining actively employed by the lessee as the Senior Director of Commercial Leases. The clause was clear. If my employment was terminated for any reason other than my voluntary resignation, the lease would automatically terminate upon 10 days' written notice. Upon termination, the land and all access rights would revert to me, or the rent would automatically adjust to a penalty rate equal to 15% of the gross monthly sales of any tenant utilizing the parcel for access. Richard Vance had signed it without hesitation, laughing and saying, "I would never leave the company anyway." Now, 15 years later, his son Ryan had just handed me my cardboard box. I walked out of the corporate office, took a deep breath of the spring air, and called Evelyn Hale. It was time to pull the pin on the grenade. The tension in the office had been building for months, starting almost the exact day Richard Vance's health forced him to step away. Ryan Vance didn't just want to run Summit Retail Properties, he wanted to stamp his own name on it and erase his father's legacy. Within his first week as Chief Operating Officer, Ryan brought in Gavin Brooks, his college roommate from his MBA days. Gavin was 34 years old, wore wireless earbuds like they were a fashion accessory, and spoke entirely in corporate buzzwords. Ryan created a brand new title for him, Vice President of Digital Infrastructure and Portfolio Optimization. It didn't take long for me to realize that Gavin's primary job was to find a way to justify my termination. Every morning I would arrive at the office at 7:30 a.m., just as I had for 20 years. I liked the quiet of the early morning to review our lease rolls, monitor the operating expenses, and study the local market trends. But lately, my mornings were interrupted by Ryan and Gavin's loud discussions in the adjacent glass-walled conference room. They were obsessed with disrupting the commercial real estate space, talking endlessly about automated tenant portals, algorithmic pricing models, and cutting overhead. The immediate flashpoint was the Valumax lease renewal. I had spent 2 years laying the groundwork for this deal. I had sat in countless greasy diners with Clara Jenkins, listening to her concerns about logistics, delivery schedules, and the changing footprint of physical retail. I knew that Valumax needed a $1.5 million tenant improvement allowance to modernize their loading docks and warehouse area to handle their new automated inventory systems. I had structured the lease to include this allowance, amortizing the cost over the 15-year term. It was a standard win-win commercial real estate transaction, but Ryan and Gavin saw it differently. Why are we giving away 1.5 million in capital expenditure to a tenant that has no choice but to stay? Ryan demanded during a weekly pipeline meeting, tapping his pen aggressively against his tablet. Because if they leave, Ryan, the mortgage defaults, I explained patiently, keeping my voice level. Valumax represents 40% of our rent roll. The bank's debt service coverage ratio covenant is 1.25x. Without Valumax, we fall to 0.67x. The bank will foreclose on the entire plaza. The $1.5 million is a drop in the bucket compared to losing a $180 million asset. Gavin smiled condescendingly. Walter, you're thinking like it's 2006. Our predictive models show that if ValueMax leaves, we can easily carve up their 180,000 square feet into 6 smaller mid-box retail spaces. We can charge 20% higher rent per square foot and avoid the tenant improvement allowance entirely. And how long will those spaces sit empty while you get permits? Run new utilities and find 6 new tenants, I asked. 6 months? A year? The bank won't wait. The covenant is tested quarterly. If we drop below 125x for even 1 quarter, the loan is in technical default. Have you spoken to Commercial First Bank about this? Ryan waved his hand dismissively. I have a meeting with the bank next month. They aren't going to foreclose on a premier asset like Summit's Plaza over a temporary transition. You're dragging your feet, Walter. You've been sitting on this lease draft for 3 weeks. I think you're just holding out to make sure the signing falls in this fiscal quarter to secure your commission. The accusation was insulting, but I didn't let him see it register. In reality, I was waiting for Clara Jenkins to receive final board approval from ValueMax's corporate headquarters in Chicago. I had done my job. The lease was fully negotiated. All it needed was my signature as the authorized leasing officer and Ryan's signature as the managing partner. On a rainy Thursday afternoon, I received a calendar invite from Ryan's assistant. The subject line was a generic portfolio review, scheduled for 4 p.m. in the executive boardroom. When I walked in, Ryan was sitting at the head of the table. To his right was Gavin Brooks, looking smugly at his laptop. To his left was Laura Adams, our Director of Human Resources. Laura looked deeply uncomfortable and wouldn't make eye contact with me. That was the first red flag. "Sit down, Walter," Ryan said, his voice flat. I sat down and placed my notebook on the table. "What's on the agenda?" Ryan didn't beat around the bush. "We are restructuring the leasing department. As of today, the position of Senior Director of Commercial Leases is being eliminated. Gavin's team is taking over all leasing operations through our new automated platform." Laura Adams slid a document across the table. "This is your separation agreement, Walter. We are offering you 2 weeks of severance for every year of service, which comes to 40 weeks of pay." I looked at the document, then looked at Ryan. "And what about the ValueMax lease renewal?" "It's scheduled to be signed next week. Under my contract, my commission is earned upon the execution of the lease terms I negotiated. That's a 1% commission on a $127.5 million contract. That's $1,275,000. Ryan let out a dry laugh. "That's the thing, Walter. You haven't signed it. In fact, you've been willfully delaying the signing of the ValueMax lease to protect your commission. Because of this delay, which has put the company's relationship with a major tenant at risk, we are terminating you for cause. There will be no commission, and there will be no 40-week severance." "For cause," I repeated, looking at Laura. "Laura, you've reviewed my file. I've had 20 years of flawless performance reviews. I've brought in over 60% of this company's current revenue." Laura looked down at her hands. "The COO has documented what he defines as a pattern of insubordination and willful delay of critical corporate transactions, Walter. The company has decided to proceed on those grounds." Ryan leaned forward, his eyes gleaming with triumph. "You're outdated, Walter. Your methods are from the Stone Age. We don't need you to close ValueMax. Gavin has already emailed Clara Jenkins, informing her that you are no longer with the company and that Gavin will be executing the contract on Monday. You're done. Pack your desk." I looked at Ryan, I looked at Gavin, I saw the sheer, unearned confidence in their eyes. They had no idea they were sitting on a ticking time bomb, and they had just cut the red wire. I pulled my pen from my pocket, signed the acknowledgement of termination without signing the release of claims, and slid it back to Laura. "Understood," I said quietly. I walked back to my office, packed my personal photos and my brass desk clock into a cardboard box, and handed my keycard to Ryan, who had followed me to watch me leave. 10 minutes later, I was in my car, dialing Evelyn Hale's office. The game was on. The morning after I was fired, I sat in the conference room of Hale & Associates on the 14th floor of the city center building. Evelyn Hale, my real estate attorney of 15 years, was reviewing the original 2011 ground lease agreement for Parcel B4. She had a cup of black coffee in one hand and a yellow highlighter in the other. "They really didn't check the file, did they?" Evelyn asked, a thin smile playing on her lips. Ryan Vance doesn't read files, Evelyn. He looks at spreadsheets, I replied, taking a sip of my own coffee. He saw a $250,000 salary and a $1.275 million commission and thought he could delete me like a line item in an Excel sheet. Evelyn turned to the signature page, which bore my signature as the owner of Parcel B4 and Richard Vance's signature as the president of Summit Retail Properties. Then she flipped back to Clause 14.2. Let's read the exact language to make sure we are on rock-solid ground, Evelyn said. Clause 14.2, this ground lease and all associated access, utility, and parking easements granted herein are strictly contingent upon the personal and active employment of Walter Thorne by the lessee as the Senior Director of Commercial Leases. In the event that Walter Thorne's employment with the lessee is terminated for any reason other than his voluntary resignation, this ground lease shall terminate automatically upon 10 days, written notice from the lessor to the lessee. Upon termination, all rights of access, ingress, egress, and occupancy on Parcel B4 shall immediately revert to the lessor, and any continued occupancy or utilization of the parcel by the lessee or its subtenants shall constitute unlawful detainer. She looked up at me. Since they fired you yesterday, and we have the written termination notice signed by Ryan Vance citing redundancy and restructuring. They cannot claim you resigned. The condition has been triggered. I've already drafted the notice of default and ground lease termination. We will send it via certified mail and have it hand-delivered by a process server to their corporate office today. The 10-day clock starts tomorrow. Perfect, I said. Now, what about the secondary easements? Parcel B4 holds the primary utility lines for the rear of the plaza, the dumpster compactors, and the main access road for Volumax's loading docks, Evelyn explained. Once this lease terminates, Summit Retail Properties has no legal right to run electricity or water through that parcel, nor do they have the right to allow trucks to drive across it. It's private property. After leaving Evelyn's office, I sat in my car and dialed Clara Jenkins. Walter. Clara answered on the second ring, her tone warm but professional. I heard what happened. I got an email from a Gavin Brooks this morning claiming he is taking over the account. I was shocked. What is going on over there? Ryan Vance wanted to cut costs, Clara. He fired me yesterday to avoid paying my commission on your renewal, I said. Clara sighed. That's incredibly short-sighted. You're the only reason we were renewing, Walter. Gavin Brooks sent me a revised contract this morning. The idiot tried to claw back the $1.5 million tenant improvement allowance we spent 6 months negotiating. He claimed it was non-essential capital expenditure. Don't sign it, Clara, I said, keeping my voice calm. In fact, don't sign anything from Summit Retail Properties right now. I'm calling you as a friend and as the owner of the land beneath your loading docks. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. What do you mean, Walter? I explained the history of Parcel B4. I explained how I had purchased the land in 2011 to save the project and how the ground lease was tied to my employment. I explained that because I was fired, the ground lease was terminating in 10 days. In 10 days, Summit Retail Properties will lose all legal access to Parcel B4, I told her. That means your delivery trucks will not have the legal right to access your loading docks. If they cross that property line, they will be trespassing. If Summit represents in the lease renewal that they have full easement and access rights to the property, they are committing fraud. Your legal team needs to run a title search immediately. Clara's voice went cold. Our loading docks are the lifeblood of that store, Walter. We receive 12 semi-truck deliveries a day. If we can't receive inventory, the store can't operate. I am calling our general counsel right now. I'll make sure the signing is halted immediately. Thank you, Clara. I'd appreciate it if you kept my ownership of the parcel quiet until the 10 days are up. Let them think you're just doing routine legal due diligence. You got it. Walter, keep me posted. My next call was to Sean Brody, the Chief Code Enforcement Officer for the city. I had known Sean for 15 years. We had worked together on zoning approvals for several Summit developments. Sean, it's Walter Thorne, I said. Walter, good to hear from you. What can I do for you today? I need to report a major safety and zoning violation at Summit Plaza, I said. As of 10 days from now, The emergency fire lane at the rear of the plaza, which runs across parcel B4, will no longer be authorized or leased by the property owner. Since the fire lane access easement will be revoked, the property will no longer comply with Section 503 of the International Fire Code regarding emergency access roads. The entire plaza will be in violation of its municipal occupancy permit. Sean sounded concerned. That's serious, Walter. If the fire lane is compromised, we have to issue a notice of violation. If it isn't resolved, we have to revoke the certificate of occupancy for the plaza. Are you sure about the lease termination? I'm the owner of the land, Sean. I'll email you the copy of the termination notice as soon as it's served today. Understood, Walter. Once I have the document, my office will schedule an inspection for the day the lease expires. We'll have to issue the violation notice immediately if access is blocked. I hung up the phone and leaned back in my seat. Ryan Vance wanted to play corporate chess, but he didn't even know the rules of the board. The fuse was lit. Now, I just had to wait for the explosion. At exactly 6 a.m. on Monday morning, the 10-day notice expired. I stood at the edge of Summit Plaza, holding a cup of hot coffee, as a crew from steel-clad fencing unloaded concrete K-rail barricades and 10-foot chain-link fence panels from a flatbed truck. Evelyn Hale stood next to me, holding a certified copy of the deed for parcel B4 and the recorded termination of the ground lease. We had marked the exact property line using the county surveyor's coordinates. The line ran straight through the middle of the rear asphalt driveway, cutting off the loading docks, the dumpster compactors, and the truck turnaround zone. By 7 a.m., the fence was fully erected, reinforced with heavy sandbags and concrete barricades. Painted plywood signs were hung every 20 feet, private property, no trespass, off-fours access only. At 7:30 a.m., the first Valumax delivery truck, a massive 53-foot semi-trailer loaded with frozen goods, pulled into the plaza's rear entrance. The driver tapped his brakes, staring in confusion at the chain-link fence blocking the path to the loading docks. He tried to maneuver the truck, but there wasn't enough room to turn around. Within 20 minutes, 3 more semi-trucks arrived, backing up onto the main access road and spilling out onto the public highway. The horn honking and traffic congestion began to choke the entrance to the shopping center. At 9 a.m., Sean Brody arrived in a city vehicle. He walked the perimeter of the fence, looked at the backed-up delivery trucks, and shook his head. "You didn't waste any time, Walter," Sean said, writing on a clipboard. "I gave them 10 days, Sean. They ignored the notice," I replied. "Well, the fire lane is completely blocked, and there's no emergency vehicle access to the rear of the anchor tenant building," Sean said. He walked over to the plaza's on-site property manager, who had just run out of the office. White-faced and trembling, Sean handed him a bright orange sheet of paper. "This is a formal notice of violation for blocking a designated fire lane. Summit Retail Properties has 48 hours to clear this obstruction and restore access. If it isn't resolved, the city will suspend the occupancy permit for the entire plaza, and every business here will have to shut down." While the property manager was frantically calling corporate, Gavin Brooks arrived at the scene. He jumped out of his sports car, his eyes wide with anger, and marched toward me. "Walter, what the hell is this?" Gavin screamed, pointing at the fence. "You can't do this. This is a commercial shopping center. You're blocking our tenants' deliveries. This is tortious interference. We're going to sue you for every dime you have." Evelyn Hale stepped in front of him, holding up her clipboard. "Mr. Brooks, I am Walter Thorne's legal counsel. This land, designated as Parcel B4, is private property owned personally by Mr. Thorne. The ground lease with Summit Retail Properties was terminated effective today due to a breach of the Conditional Employment Covenant in Clause 14.2. Your company has no legal right to occupy, utilize, or cross this land. If you or any of your agents step past this fence, we will have the police arrest you for criminal trespass. And if any of your tenants' trucks cross this line, we will sue Summit Retail Properties for unlawful detainer and seek triple damages." Gavin's jaw dropped. He looked at the fence, then at the backed-up semi-trucks, and finally at the orange code violation notice in the property manager's hand. This is ridiculous. You can't just block a road." "It's not a road, Gavin. It's my land," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. Tell Ryan he should have read the property file before he fired me. Gavin turned on his heel and ran back to his car, dialing his phone furiously. Back at the Summit corporate headquarters, the atmosphere had descended into absolute panic. Ryan Vance was sitting at his desk, staring at the screen of his phone. First, it was Clara Jenkins from Valumax, who didn't even wait for him to speak. Ryan, our morning delivery trucks are sitting on the state highway. We are losing $150,000 a day in sales. If those trucks aren't unloaded in the next 4 hours, our legal department is filing an emergency injunction and suing Summit Retail Properties for $10 million for breach of the quiet enjoyment covenant in our lease. We are also halting all negotiations for the lease renewal. Before Ryan could reply, the phone rang again. It was the commercial loan officer from Commercial First Bank. Ryan, we just received an alert about a municipal fire code violation at Summit Plaza. We also hear Valumax is halting their lease renewal. If the occupancy permit is suspended by the city, or if Valumax defaults on their tenancy, you will be in violation of the mortgage covenant. We will accelerate the $120 million loan and initiate foreclosure proceedings immediately. You have 48 hours to fix this. Then the door to Ryan's office flew open. His father, Richard Vance, walked in. He was leaning on a cane, his face pale from his recent health issues, but his eyes were filled with an icy fury. "Dad," Ryan stammered, standing up. "What are you doing here? You should be resting." "Shut up, Ryan," Richard roared, slamming his cane against the floor. "I just got a call from Clara Jenkins. She told me you fired Walter. She told me you tried to cut her tenant allowance. And she told me Walter has fenced off the loading docks because you triggered the personal employment clause on parcel B4. Dad, it's just a minor land dispute. We can file an injunction." "You idiot," Richard yelled. "There is no injunction. Walter owns the land. He bought it with his own money when Otis Miller refused to sell to us. I signed that ground lease myself. It's a valid recorded covenant. If Walter blocks that land, we lose Valumax. If we lose Valumax, the bank takes the Plaza. The Plaza is 60% of our family's net worth. You've ruined us in less than 6 months." Richard turned to Gavin Brooks, who had just walked into the room. "And you, get out of my office. You're fired. Collect your things and get out before I have security throw you out." Richard turned back to his son, his voice shaking with anger. "Get your coat, Ryan. We are going to find Walter, and pray to God he is willing to talk to us." We met at the Oakwood Diner, a quiet, old-school establishment with leather booths and wood-paneled walls, located just a mile from Summit Plaza. I had chosen the location because it was where Richard Vance and I had celebrated our first major commercial acquisition 20 years ago. When Richard walked in, leaning heavily on his cane, he looked older and frailer than I had ever seen him. Behind him walked Ryan, looking like a schoolboy who had just been dragged to the principal's office. The arrogance was completely gone, replaced by a sullen, panicked silence. Evelyn Hale and I were already seated in a corner booth, our folders laid out on the table. Richard slid into the booth opposite me, while Ryan sat beside him, staring at his hands. "Walter," Richard began, his voice raspy. "Thank you for meeting us." "Of course, Richard. I always have time for you," I said, keeping my tone respectful but firm. "But let's be clear. I'm here to discuss a business transaction between the owner of Parcel B4 and the representatives of Summit Retail Properties." Richard closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. "I deserve that. I made a mistake, Walter. I let my son take the reins without supervising him, and I let him treat the most valuable asset this company had like garbage. I apologize." "The company apologizes." "I appreciate that, Richard," I said. "But apologies don't resolve the legal and financial reality of the situation. Right now, Summit Plaza is 48 hours away from having its occupancy permit revoked. Commercial First Bank is preparing to accelerate your $120 million mortgage, and Valumax is preparing a $10 million lawsuit. We need to look at the terms of resolution." Evelyn slid a 3-page document across the table. Ryan reached for it, but Richard slapped his hand away and picked it up himself. "Evelyn, go ahead and walk them through the terms," I said. Evelyn cleared her throat. "The terms for restoring the easement rights and resolving the lease dispute are as follows. First, Ryan Vance must be completely stripped of all operational authority at Summit Retail Properties. He will be demoted to a non-voting advisory role in the company's residential management division in the northern branch, with no involvement in commercial operations. Richard Vance will resume his position as managing partner, or the board will hire an independent property management firm to run the commercial portfolio. Ryan flinched, his face turning red. You can't dictate our corporate structure. Be quiet, Ryan, Richard snapped, glare staring at his son. Go on, Evelyn second. Evelyn continued. The ground lease for parcel B4 will be renegotiated. The lease term will be 15 years, matching the duration of the new Valumax lease. The new rent for the parcel will be $25,000 per month, due on the first of each month, with a 3% annual escalation clause. This replaces the previous nominal rate of $100 per month. Ryan gasped. $25,000 a month? That's $300. How's in a year? For a strip of parking lot and loading docks? That's highway robbery. It's market value for a parcel that controls the viability of a $180 million asset. Evelyn replied coldly. Without it, your asset is worth zero. You can pay the $25,000 a month, or you can let the bank foreclose. Third, Evelyn went on, Summit Retail Properties will pay Walter Thorne his full, earned commission of $1,275,000 for the Valumax lease renewal. The lease must be executed in its original form, including the $1.5 million tenant improvement allowance. Fourth, Summit will pay Mr. Thorne a lump sum consulting fee of $500. Silozone to oversee the transition and manage the Valumax relationship over the next 6 months. Finally, the board will issue a written, signed statement acknowledging Walter's 20 years of service and retracting the false for cause termination. Richard read through the document slowly. The silence in the booth was heavy, broken only by the low hum of the diner's refrigerator. If we don't sign, Richard asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. If you don't sign, the fence stays up, I said. The city will shut down the plaza on Wednesday. Valumax will pull out, the bank will foreclose, and Summit Retail Properties will go under. You have the numbers, Richard. You know I'm not bluffing. Richard looked at his son, then back at me. He let out a long, heavy sigh. No, you're not bluffing. You've always been a straight shooter, Walter. I should have remembered that. He pulled a silver pen from his jacket pocket, signed his name on the managing partner line, and pushed the document toward Ryan. Sign it. Ryan, Dad, we can fight this in court. Sign it, Richard barked, or I will disinherit you before we leave this booth. Sign it now. With a shaking hand, Ryan took the pen and signed his name, authorizing the corporate resolution and the wire transfers. Evelyn verified signatures and took out her phone. The wire instructions have been sent to your finance department. We will wait here until the funds are cleared. It took exactly 45 minutes. My phone buzzed with a notification from my bank. The wire transfer of $1,775,000, representing my commission and consulting fee, had successfully cleared. I looked at the screen, then looked up at Richard. The funds are in. Evelyn, draft the immediate temporary easement license so the trucks can unload while we record the permanent lease. I picked up my phone and called the fencing crew. This is Walter. You can take the fence down. Open the access road. Richard stood up, leaning on his cane. He looked at me, a mixture of defeat and respect in his eyes. Good game, Walter. I just wish my son had been smart enough not to play it. Take care of your health, Richard, I said. Within 2 hours, the fence was gone, and the line of delivery trucks was rolling back into the Valumax loading docks. Clara Jenkins signed the 15-year lease renewal the next morning, securing the future of the plaza and keeping the bank at bay. As for me, I officially retired. I am 52 years old now, financially independent and free. I have $1,775 million sitting in high-yield accounts, and every single month, like clockwork, a check for $25,000 clears in my account. It is my mailbox money, paid by Summit Retail Properties for the right to let their trucks drive over my 2.5 acres of asphalt. Sometimes, on a sunny afternoon, I drive down to Summit Plaza. I don't go into the office. I just park my car in the front lot, buy a cup of coffee, and watch the big semi-trucks rumble around the back of the building toward the loading docks. Every time a truck crosses that property line, I smile. I own the ground beneath their feet, and they are paying for my retirement, one delivery at a time.